scenarios where, again, you put a variable called pagenum in the URL or the post body or in a scope that you control. Because what's going to happen is the CF param is going to execute, and then it's going to say, oh, well, pagenum already exists. Pagenum already contains, script, alert, whatever, and it's not going to assign the value 1. So this is really more of a confusion between what different tags do. Environment variables, you have a CGI scope that we talked about before, and this is similar to other CGI scopes in different application development platforms, except that in ColdFusion, you can actually manipulate a whole lot more than you can in other platforms. So normally you can alter CGI.queryString or CGI.host. In ColdFusion, you can manipulate almost everything in the CGI scope. So for example, CGI.httphost in a normal request is going to contain whatever's in the host header. But if you provide a host header and an HTTP header that's actually called HTTP host, that will override the value of CGI HTTP host, and it will actually contain in the lower code snippet there evil.com instead of example.com. I have no idea why it does that, why they allow you to do that. There appears to be no defensible reason for allowing you to overwrite CGI variables, but there you have it. You can actually create any HTTP header, so it can be HTTP header called foo, and that will create a variable in the CGI scope called CGI.foo. Nobody knows why. More dangerously, you can override things that in other application development platforms you can never override. You can, if you have a ASP.NET or Java page, you can never override server software or path info or some of these other things that are generally defined on the server side and considered immutable. And there are a lot that you can actually override just by using an HTTP header. You can override CGI.authUser, which doesn't seem like something you should be able to override, but yet you can. If you're deploying this in a situation where you're using basic auth or NTLM auth and the actual authenticated username is stored in a CGI variable, you want to make sure not to use auth user. You want to make sure to use remote user. It'll be populated the same way for either one, but remote user is not overridable, and auth user is. Again, no idea why. And then finally, before we get into the Java stuff, persistence issues. We talked about the client scope before and the fact that you could configure that to be using the registry or the cookies. And essentially, if they have it defined, or if you have client management enabled and you have client variables set to use cookies, then tampering is always going to be possible. Just you can poison any cookie. That's a well-known fact. But oftentimes, the developer will just say, "Well, I'm using client scope variables to persist data across multiple visits to the site." They may not actually know how that works, right? It's a black magic a lot of the time, but it's actually in a cookie. So if you put something sensitive in a client scope variable and you're not realizing as a developer that it's in the cookie, then that may open up the application to some really, really simple cookie poisoning attacks. The cookie that's used for the client scope variables is not encrypted in any way. There's no MAC, there's no HMAC. Everything is in plain text. It's delimited by, I forget, but there's basically a name-value pair with delimiters, and it can be manipulated in whatever way you want. Again, the remaining part of the talk, we'll look at what ColdFusion looks underneath, and I think we have about 10 minutes left.
So as we talked about earlier, right now, as of ColdFusion 6 or MX, ColdFusion is now Java-based. Everything is compiled to every page, every component is compiled to Java classes, and then run inside the context of servlets. Now, CF or ColdFusion lets you compile. You can precompile pages in addition to having them run at runtime. Most of the time, you don't need to do this because they still want to make it easy to use, and so you can still, deploy your site live with the plain source CFM and CSV files, and have those be editable, and changes get detected and recompiled on the fly. You can precompile if you'd like to speed things up a little bit, and so for each class. For each file, it generates one class per page or component, And then in addition, any functions, any UDFs defined in that pager function also get their own classes. And CF ColdFusion comes with a utility called CF-compile, which does the pre-compilation if you want. So if you have more than one class that gets generated for a given file, it doesn't generate multiple files. It generates one. It concatenates all the related Java classes related to a given source file, and it puts them into one concatenated file, and the file name is identical to the source file. I suppose it made sense to somebody, but that's not necessarily easily analyzed. You kind of have to separate them. And also, you can take those files and then bundle them up as an EAR or WAR file and shove them into your application server of choice. So as I mentioned, they use a fairly non-standard format for bundling up classes instead of using a jar or multiple files. So we wrote a quick utility to undo this, and it says as of now, but I haven't gotten around to adding that yet. But I promise to have it up by the end of the night. And it's a free open source Java utility that unpacks all of these compiled files. So if you run across files that have been precompiled with the cfcompile.bat or .sh, you can use this tool to go through and generate individual files, which then you can load into either Pro or anything you'd like, or JAD or JD GUI, and use that. So the way these work is, the way these classes work in ColdFusion is that generally there's one function that is the entry point. For pages and components, that method is called runPage. For UDF method, it's named runFunction. And occasionally when I say they, I mean the compiler factors out certain blocks of code, of generated code, and creates separate methods that are then called by these given methods. And additionally, there are other methods inside of a class and part of the interface that get called to set various data and retrieve and access our methods for various things. So because you can use, because the variable names are accessible dynamically in a way that's not really possible in Java outside of reflection, the generated Java is actually kind of ugly sometimes. When it comes to variables, you can see we have a simple piece of code over here that just sets a variable named vfoo to value 1. And there's a similar assignment using, well, if it's not assigned already, as Chris mentioned, p-bar will be assigned to value 2. And then those values are printed out. This is what it looks like with a lot of setup stuff omitted where the comment lines are. This is what it looks like. In some cases, it generates actual properties of the generated Java class. In this case, vfoo and p-bar. And it assigns those. Those represent not the actual variables themselves, but they represent bindings to the current scope of the variable, either the local scope or the scope of the calling page, which is also accessible, or other scopes as well. And because they represent bindings, you can bindings in the table, you can use these accessor objects to set values, and that's what it looks like from when you have very simple static assignments like this. Thought I had a slide that said it, but so when there are static references like this, but that's not the only case. As I mentioned earlier, you can specify the name of a variable to set dynamically, and so I think I have a slide later that shows that. And so here's in this. This is the kind of the setup to how those get bound. Those variable scope and local scope objects are basically tables. They represent all of the variables in a given scope and and here's the setup for a method that binds them. Here we are. Now here's the dynamic references. you can access variables in scopes not only through the bound and generated object methods, but you can also do it through a whole host of methods. And there's a bigger list in the paper, a whole host of methods that basically use dynamic strings as names of variables to read and write. So in this case, you have, So there are other ways to set variables other than cfset, cfparam, gfquery. We mentioned earlier results in variables being imported into the local scope. Structures, which are structures can act in similar to scopes in that they have properties, and you can set variables to them. That's also true of components as well. Components have their own object associated with them, and other various utilities or other various utility tags. And as I mentioned earlier, you can bundle these applications up as a WAR file, and they're handled by various servlets. The structure is actually quite complicated. They're definitely not just raw JSP pages or raw servlets. There's one servlet that handles all of a given set of CFMs and all of a given set of CFCs. And that sets up all the data for the function, results in the application.cfm being invoked or CFC being invoked if they exist. And included in the WAR is, in addition to these servlets, is the administrator thing. And this is the administrator is a console that administrators can use to set up things like data sources and various request parameters, some of the filtering options. A lot of that is accessible through this web app. And it's you can optionally include it in the WAR file. It gives you the option. And even if you don't, if you check no, a lot of that is still there, and that's still mapped in the default WAR. So be on the lookout for that. If you are overseeing people who are deploying using this, you might want to, after these WARs get generated, you might want to unpack it and take out some of the things that aren't in use if you're not going to use this administrator. One interesting thing about this is that the administrator has password protection, but there is no way to reset the password or retrieve it from files. So if you lose the password, the way Adobe tells you to get it back is to go into the XML file, neosecurity.xml, and just turn off authentication altogether. That's great, except if you forget to do that, then it just stays off. And you don't really notice because there's pretty long-lasting sessions with the ColdFusion administrator anyway. There's a bunch of other servlets. There's some that support Flash and a bunch of other things. There's JSPs. There's support for running actual JSPs, I should say. There's Flex integration. There's some graph support and other things. We can skip through this. So I guess we're going to have some final thoughts. Does anybody have any questions first?
This is the last slide.
OK, great.
So there's conclusions to take away. And in the paper, we actually have takeaways for different audiences. So we have takeaways for developers, takeaways for pen testers, and takeaways for Adobe in the white paper. But this is just kind of an overarching thing. So ColdFusion was